Most people pay tax before they spend a single cent. You earn $1, the government takes 30 cents, and you try to build a life with the 70 cents left over. That is the standard rule set. But billionaires play by an entirely different physics engine. They do the exact opposite. They let their assets grow completely untaxed. They borrow against those assets to spend money they technically don't have, and then they let the entire tax bill vanish into thin air when they die. That isn't a conspiracy theory. It is a specific legal strategy called buy, borrow, die. It's the reason why, in some years, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have paid less in federal income tax than a manager at a fast food franchise. If you are trying to build wealth by just working harder and getting a bigger salary, you are running up a down escalator. Today, I am going to break down the mechanics of how the ultra-wealthy exit the tax system, the specific math behind the loophole, and whether a regular person can actually pull this off without going bankrupt. I'm Tong, and this is where we talk about money without the hype and without the sales pitch. I've spent years analysing how capital moves, and the buy, borrow, die strategy is probably the most powerful example of how the tax code favours capital over labour. It essentially makes income tax optional for the people who have the most income. If you want to understand the plumbing of the financial system so you can stop leaking money, go ahead and subscribe. It's the best return on investment you'll get for $0. Now, to understand how this works, we have to start by looking at the trap that catches almost everyone else: the addiction to the paycheck. There is a pervasive myth that having a high income makes you rich. We see a surgeon making $400,000 a year and think they've made it. But in the eyes of the IRS, that surgeon is the perfect customer. The US tax system, and really most tax systems globally, are designed to tax flow, not reservoirs. They tax money when it moves. When money moves from an employer to you, that is a taxable event. When you sell a stock, that is a taxable event. The wealthy understand that if you want to keep your money, you must stop it from moving. The buy, borrow, die strategy starts with a fundamental rejection of the salary. While the rest of us are fighting for a raise, the ultra-wealthy are fighting to keep their taxable income as close to zero as possible. This is why you see CEOs taking $1 salaries. They aren't doing it for charity, they are doing it because a salary is the most inefficient way to receive value. Let's look at the math of the high earner versus the asset owner. If you earn $1 million in salary, you don't get $1 million. You trigger the top marginal tax rate. In the US, federal tax alone knocks that down significantly. Then you have state taxes. In California or New York, you are losing nearly half of that paycheck before it hits your direct deposit. You are effectively working for the government until June. But compare that to an investor whose portfolio grows by $1 million. That growth is what we call unrealized gains. It exists on paper. Their net worth went up. Their purchasing power potential went up. But because they didn't sell the stock, the IRS sees $0 of income. The tax bill is zero. The high-income earner has $600,000 to invest. The asset owner has $1 million working for them. Over 10 or 20 years, that difference doesn't just add up, it compounds exponentially. The tax drag on a salary is the single biggest friction to building wealth. The problem is that we are psychologically wired to want liquidity. We want cash in the bank. We feel safe when we see the checking account number go up. The buy, borrow, die strategy requires a level of discipline that feels unnatural. You have to be comfortable being paper rich and cash poor. It feels risky to have all your net worth tied up in Amazon stock or a real estate portfolio. The average person gets a bonus and immediately thinks about how to spend it. The wealthy person sees cash as a liability because cash is being eroded by inflation and doesn't generate tax-deferred growth. The psychological shift here is moving from wanting money to wanting assets. It sounds like a subtle distinction, but it's the difference between paying 50% tax and paying zero. But here is the obvious problem. You can't eat stock options. You can't pay for a yacht with a share of Berkshire Hathaway unless you sell it. And the moment you sell it, you trigger the capital gains tax, and the whole strategy falls apart. So how do billionaires live lavish lifestyles without ever selling the assets that make them rich? They don't use their own money. They use the bank's money. And this is where the math gets absolutely wild. Step 1 is simply buy. But it's specific. You have to buy assets that appreciate in value without generating taxable dividends, if you can avoid them. We are talking about equities, businesses, real estate, or art. The goal is to maximize unrealized gains. I mentioned ProPublica earlier. They did a deep dive into IRS files and found that guys like Buffett and Bezos sat on massive accumulations of wealth. Bezos saw his wealth grow by roughly $99 billion over a few years, but he reported only a tiny fraction of that as income. Why? Because he didn't sell, he just held. The US tax code does not tax wealth directly, it taxes realized income. As long as you are just holding the asset, you are invisible to the tax collector. This is the accumulation phase. You are building a mountain of value that is technically locked away. Think about the compounding effect of not paying taxes. If you sell a stock every year to rebalance, you pay capital gains tax, shrinking your pot by 15 or 20% each time. If you hold forever, that money stays in the pot, earning returns on itself. Yale's Budget Lab refers to this as deferral, and it's powerful. It's like getting an interest-free loan from the government for the amount of tax you would have paid. Over 30 years, a portfolio that is never taxed until the end will be worth significantly more than a portfolio that is taxed annually, even if the pre-tax returns are exactly the same. The buy step is all about harnessing the power of tax-deferred compounding. It is boring, it requires patience, but it is the foundation of the dynasty. The hardest part of step 1 isn't buying, it's not selling. When a stock doubles, every instinct in your body says, lock it in. We are loss-averse creatures. We are terrified the gain will vanish. But in this strategy, selling is the enemy. Selling triggers a taxable event. It reveals your wealth to the IRS. The ultra-wealthy have a different mindset. They look at a $100 million gain and think, if I sell this, I lose $20 million to the government immediately. They view the tax not as a contribution to society, but as a massive management fee they can avoid simply by doing nothing. Inactivity is the strategy. It takes nerves of steel to watch your net worth fluctuate by billions and sit on your hands. But that is the price of entry. So the protocol for the buy phase is straightforward. Accumulate appreciating assets and refuse to realize gains. But this creates that liquidity problem I mentioned. You are worth billions on paper, but you can't buy a sandwich. This is where step 2 comes in, and it's the mechanism that turns the tax code on its head. Instead of selling the asset to get cash, you pledge the asset to get a loan. This is called buy, borrow, die, and the borrow part is where the magic happens. It exploits a simple fact of the tax code. Debt is not income. If I give you $1 million in exchange for work, that's income. If the bank gives you $1 million as a loan, that is a liability. You don't pay tax on a loan. You might be thinking, sure, no tax, but what about interest? Isn't paying interest just as bad as paying taxes? And for you and me, with credit card rates at 25%, the answer is yes. But for the ultra-wealthy, the interest rate they pay is often lower than the rate of inflation. They are essentially getting paid to borrow money. Let me show you how the math of security-backed lending actually works. This isn't like going to a bank for a personal loan where they ask for your pay stubs. When you have 10 million or 100 million in assets, you get access to what's called an S block, a securities-backed line of credit. It works like a home equity line of credit, but instead of your house, the collateral is your stock portfolio. Charles Schwab, Goldman Sachs, and private banks love these loans. They are incredibly safe for the bank because the collateral is liquid. If you don't pay, they just sell your stock. Because the risk is so low, the interest rates are tiny. We are talking about rates that are often pegged just slightly above the base rate. For a billionaire, borrowing at 3 or 4% is common. They take this loan, spend it on their lifestyle, and because it's debt, the IRS doesn't touch a penny of it. Here is the arbitrage math. Let's say you have $10 million in the S&P 500. Historically, that grows at about 8 to 10% a year. You borrow $1 million to live on at 4% interest. You are paying $40,000 in interest to access that cash. But your portfolio, the $10 million, is still invested. If it grows at 8%, it makes $800,000. So you made $800,000, you paid $40,000 in interest, and you lived tax-free on the $1 million you borrowed. Compare that to selling. If you sold $1 million of stock, you'd pay roughly $240,000 in capital gains taxes. Paying $40,000 in interest is mathematically superior to paying $240,000 in taxes. You are essentially renting your own money for cheaper than the cost of taxing it. This requires a total reprogramming of how we view debt. Middle-class financial advice is always get out of debt. And that is good advice when debt is consumer debt used to buy depreciating assets like clothes or cars. But for the wealthy, debt is a tool of arbitrage. It is a bridge that allows them to access liquidity without breaking the compound interest chain. They don't fear debt, they respect it. They treat the bank as a partner. The psychological barrier for a normal person is the fear of owing money. For the strategist, the fear is interrupting the compounding of their asset base. They would rather owe the bank money than give the government a permanent cut of their principal. The protocol here is managing the loan-to-value ratio, or LTV. Banks will usually let you borrow up to 50% or even 70% of your portfolio value. But the smart money never goes that high. They usually keep their borrowing to 10 or 20% of the portfolio value. Why? To avoid the margin call. If the market dips and your loan is too big relative to your assets, the bank forces you to sell at the bottom. That is the nightmare scenario. So the borrow step isn't reckless spending. It is calculated, low-leverage borrowing designed to cover living expenses while leaving the bulk of the fortune untouched to keep growing. You live on the loan, you service the interest, and you never, ever sell. So, you have bought assets, and you have borrowed against them to live. You have avoided income tax and capital gains tax for decades. But eventually, the bill comes due, right? You have a loan to repay, and you have assets with massive accumulated gains. When you die, surely the IRS steps in and takes their share. Actually, no. This is the die part of the strategy, and it contains a loophole so big you could drive a hearse through it. It's called the step-up in basis, and it essentially erases decades of tax liability in a single heartbeat. Step 3 is grim, but financially it is the miracle moment. Under current US law, when you die, your assets are passed to your heirs. But the tax code has a specific provision regarding the cost basis of those assets. The cost basis is just what you paid for the asset originally. If you bought a stock for $10 and it is worth $100, your gain is $90. If you sell it while you are alive, you pay tax on that $90. But if you die, the cost basis steps up to the fair market value at the date of your death. The IRS essentially forgets that you bought it for $10. They reset the counter to $100. Let's run the numbers on that. Imagine you bought Amazon stock in 1997 for $10,000. Today, it's worth $10 million. That is a $9,990,000 gain. If you sold it the day before you died, you would owe millions in capital gains tax. But if you die holding it, your heir inherits the stock with a cost basis of $10 million. They can sell it the very next day for $10 million and owe zero capital gains tax. The entire lifetime of growth, all those millions of dollars of value creation, is permanently tax-free. Your heir takes the proceeds, pays off the loan you took out in Step 2, and keeps the rest. The loan is settled, the tax is erased, and the cycle can start all over again. It is a complete reset of the financial scoreboard. This requires a shift from an individual mindset to a dynasty mindset. Most of us plan for our retirement. The buy, borrow, die practitioners plan for the next 3 generations. They are willing to carry debt to the grave because they know the math works out in their favor upon death. It creates a strange paradox where death is the most tax-efficient event in a billionaire's life. The psychology here is about viewing oneself not as the owner of the money, but as the steward of the capital. You don't spend the capital, you just borrow against it and pass it on. This is how old money stays old money. It isn't just about making good investments, it's about preventing the government from taking a slice every time a generation passes. The protocol for Step 3 involves estate planning. You need trusts and wills to ensure the assets pass smoothly. But the core mechanism is simply holding until the very end. This is why you see so many wealthy people holding on to concentrated stock positions well into their 90s. Diversification would trigger taxes. Holding is risky, but it's tax efficient. The strategy relies on the government keeping the step-up in basis rule. There is always talk of closing this loophole, but for now, it remains the cornerstone of generational wealth transfer in the United States. Now, before you go out and mortgage your house to buy stocks, we need a serious reality check. This strategy works beautifully on paper and beautifully for billionaires, but it has sharp teeth. The biggest risk is a margin call. If you borrow against your assets and the market crashes by 30 or 40%, the bank will call that loan. They will demand cash immediately. If you don't have it, they will sell your assets at the bottom of the market to cover the debt. You lose the asset, you trigger the tax bill you were trying to avoid, and you are left with nothing. This happened to many high flyers in 2008 and again during the 2020 crash. Leverage is a double-edged sword that cuts deep on the way down. So, can a regular person do this? In a limited way, yes. You can borrow against a home via a HELOC rather than selling it. You can use a modest margin loan for short-term liquidity. But the full buy, borrow, die strategy requires scale. You need enough assets that you can live on a tiny percentage of the loan value to weather market storms. But the lesson remains valuable. Wealth is built by owning things, not by earning wages. The system is designed to tax labour and protect capital. If you want to win, you have to stop thinking like a worker and start thinking like an owner. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit that like button so the algorithm knows you exist. And if you want to see exactly how inflation is eroding the cash you do keep, check out this video next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.